Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GBNews.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Today, we look ahead to a tumultuous week, not just in British politics, but in international affairs too. We'll explore the position of the Prime Minister, what's to come this week, and even suggestions about voting reform. All that to come after the headlines.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:32. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. The President of Ukraine is addressing the G7 World Summit leaders via video link this morning. Well, the UK Prime Minister is going to call on world leaders to take urgent action to get essential food supplies out of Ukraine. Speaking from Bavaria, Boris Johnson told broadcasters that President Zelensky has no option but to continue to defend his country from Russian aggression.
The logic of the position is still so clear. There is no deal that the President Zelensky can really do. So in those circumstances, the G7 supporters of Ukraine around the world have to continue to help the Ukrainians to rebuild their economy, to get their grain out, to export their grain. And of course, we have to help them to protect themselves. And that's what we're going to continue to do.
NHS patients in England who've been waiting for more than 2 years for surgery are being offered the option to travel to alternative hospitals to receive quicker treatment. The NHS says it will cover travel and accommodation costs to patients where appropriate. Well, the Health Service says they're now on track to eliminate 2-year waiting lists by the end of July. The body of a woman has been found in the wreckage of a house which was destroyed in a gas explosion in Birmingham last night. A man who was rescued is still in a life-threatening condition in hospital. The Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, says the barristers' strikes starting today are regrettable and will only delay justice for victims. The strikes lasting several days are part of a dispute over legal aid funding. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now, back to The Briefing with Tom.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:34 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, how safe is the Prime Minister? After the unexpected resignation of Oliver Dowden as chairman of the Conservative Party on Friday, rumours whirled of a domino effect. That further cabinet ministers may follow him out that door. That this could begin a Thatcher-style cabinet assassination. But so far, at least, it wasn't to be. Environment Secretary George Eustice has been out this morning defending the Prime Minister, who himself suggests he's looking to serve 2 more terms in office. And the Sunday papers contained no new bombshell, no junior minister resignation. Despite Number 10 putting out some quote-unquote resignation watch lists, as of yet, there is no sense of chaos. The calm before a storm, perhaps, but calm nonetheless. The words of Lord Frost in the wake of the confidence vote in the Prime Minister, that Boris Johnson has until the autumn to prove himself, seem more apt than ever. There is unease in the Tory party, certainly, but not the sense that regicide is just days away. In fact, the confidence vote taking place when it did may well have been the saving grace of the Prime Minister. Had rebellious MPs simply held their horses and kept their powder dry until after those big by-election losses, it would have been a far tougher task for the Prime Minister's team to survive that vote. Whereas now the conversation has turned to how rules may be changed to deliver a new vote. Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen told me on Friday, live on GB News, that this week he will stand for the executive of the 1922 committee on an explicit manifesto of changing the party rules to allow a further confidence vote in the Prime Minister within that 12-month exclusion period currently set out. The 1922 committee elections this summer, ordinarily ignored by much of the media, will perhaps be more consequential than ever. In order to build back from the sorry wake of those by-election defeats, Boris Johnson has to have his party's October conference in mind. He must deliver on policy, on inflation, and frankly, on economic conservatism. That's his challenge of the coming months. But for now, Boris is in Bavaria. Yes, G7 leaders have detailed plans to mobilise $600 billion in infrastructure funding, widely interpreted as a move to counter China's expansionist Belt and Road infrastructure plan. A counter-strategy to connect Asia with Africa and Europe, increasing trade and economic growth. But this plan has been criticised for its spending targets and therefore implications for debt. $600 billion will be raised over 5 years to fund that infrastructure in those middle and low-income countries. Of course, currently, China is building a lot of infrastructure in these countries, meaning that these countries are succumbing to Chinese economic orbit. Can the West counter back? Well, that's one of the things that the G7 is talking about today. We can go now to our reporter Paul Hawkins, who is in the Bavarian Alps for us. Paul, thanks for joining us. I suppose there are big international questions today for the G7, not just the influence of China, but of course, Russia as well.
Yeah, morning, Tom. The key word is influence, and you mentioned it there, countering that Chinese and Russian influence when it comes to helping others with their debt, other countries with their debt, lending them money, building infrastructure for them. That's one of the things that the G7 leaders will be countering today, trying to reduce that influence by showing that, you know, we are listening to you, broadly speaking, countries in the Southern Hemisphere. That's why today we've got Argentina, Senegal, India, Indonesia and South Africa turning up to this summit. Their leaders will be appearing, and from their perspective, they see the war, the Ukraine-Russia war, as something that's happening in Europe with European leaders. And their view is, and this is why some of them have stayed neutral when it comes to voting against Russia at the UN, their stance is, look, Western sanctions against Russia are exacerbating the world economic problems. It means we can't do business with Russia. It's driving up the price of everything, and frankly, we're quite fans of having a deal struck between Russia and Ukraine that would bring the war to a quick end. OK, Ukraine cedes some territory, but the war comes to an end, and that reason for driving up world inflation, and we know it's supply-side inflation, we know it's a problem with the world economy expanding and supply not keeping up, but one of the factors is obviously the war, and at least that factor in driving up inflation is taken away. So Germany, which is holding the presidency of the G7 at the moment, the idea of inviting those countries is to show you're listening, and look, we can step in and replace China and Russia when it comes to helping you with restructuring debt, lending you money and building roads and infrastructure for you. So that's one of the things they'll be talking about today. At the moment, Volodymyr Zelensky about to address the summit, asking effectively for more weapons, for more finance, and to continue their fight against Russia. And as I mentioned, some voices in Europe are saying, look, we need to do a deal because we need to bring this war to an end quickly. How long can we stay the course? But the UK, under Boris Johnson, and also Joe Biden's America, very much leading the charge and trying to unify the rest of the G7 behind Ukraine for the long haul. The question is, how long can that haul go on for?
Really interesting stuff there. Paul Hawkins, thank you so much for bringing it to us. I know you'll be reporting from Bavaria throughout the day here on GB News. Thank you. Well, now let's turn to how this implicates upon the UK. Joining me now in the studio is Dr. Richard Johnson, politics lecturer at the Queen Mary University of London. Welcome to the studio. I suppose we should start off with this G7 idea, this sort of countering plan to Belt and Road. Now, Belt and Road might sound really, really technical to a lot of people, but basically, China's funding a lot of infrastructure in a lot of countries. This has implications for, I remember reading about some Caribbean countries sort of moving away from the Commonwealth, moving away from the Queen because of that Chinese influence. How likely is this counterplan to succeed?
Well, some might say it's too little, too late. China has been investing in these credit projects for over a decade now. Belt and Road was initially launched in 2013, and China has brought Africa, Southern Asia, the Latin America into its orbit. It's invested trillions of dollars. Now, this is 600 billion. We're not even sure if Biden can get the 200 billion through Congress. They're talking about relying on private sector to try and make up the difference. So the scale is much smaller, and it comes much later than what China has been doing.
To what extent is it fair to describe what China has been doing as neo-colonialism, buying up countries, basically, bringing them within their orbit? I mean, looking at how much of Sri Lanka, for example, is now owned by China, it's really quite scary.
Well, if you go back to the Obama administration when this sort of was really taking off, the United States was, I think, in the wake of the Iraq War, was sort of drawing back from some of its involvement, the notion of getting overly encumbered in the rest of the world. Now, the problem with that approach, however, is that if the US and the rest of the West leaves, it doesn't mean that these countries just get on with it themselves. Other actors step in. And China saw an opportunity to step in. Actually, China, even before this, in 2009, China overtook the US as the main investor in Africa. So this has been going on for a long time. The West has been asleep at the wheel, quite frankly. Biden, I think, has recognized this is a problem, but the scale of the ambition to counter it, I would say, is much smaller than is what is needed.
It's so interesting, though, looking at those G7 leaders, many of them new to the world stage. I mean, look at some of those, for example, leading Germany. Are we going to see actually the ability of these leaders to connect with one another, to move forward as one, or will there be the sort of bickering that we've come to expect from many international summits?
I think we're seeing more unity on Russia at this summit. After there has been some bickering for the last few months, there's been some tension between Germany and the UK-US, between the UK and France. They seem to have put that aside, and I think some of the announcements that we're hearing vis-à-vis Ukraine are encouraging. On China, we are hearing some moves, and the EU has committed to contribute to this PGI initiative to counter the Belt and Road. But again, I think that the willingness to actually make some harder calls, that's some things that will actually have to hurt a bit to actually make a difference. I'm not sure that we see the unity of purpose there with China.
Well, from unity of purpose with the G7, let's turn to domestic politics now, because, of course, the Prime Minister faced a cabinet resignation on Friday, although we haven't seen anything beyond that. How many comparisons can we draw to the history of cabinets taking down Prime Ministers?
Well, of course, the one everyone talks about is Thatcher, and she won a vote of no confidence, and then was taken. Well, she won a leadership challenge, I should say, and then was taken down by her cabinet. Now, the rules have changed slightly within the Conservative Party. I think Boris has helped at the moment because there isn't a clear alternative. And I think I think two things, actually. The lack of a clear alternative and the distance from the general election. Okay, so Thatcher was a bit closer to an upcoming election. There could have even been one in 1991 rather than 92. People speculated that could have happened. Boris has years to go, theoretically. And so I think that means that the sense of urgency to replace him is not as high. And I think that the unity of purpose to find whoever will replace him is not there. And I think that means that he can survive for now. And we've also seen a lack of willingness from the cabinet really to go hard on taking him down. I think all along I've thought it's the cabinet that'll decide his fate.
Because there are lots of people on the back benches, 40% of the parliamentary party that have opposed him, at least in that secret ballot. But their voices somehow count for less.
Well, I think the vote of no confidence in him was very high, and it was actually higher than I expected. And I think that that has damaged him. I think he could have sort of made the case for recovery. Now he could still try to make it, but I think it's going to be a lot harder. I think that now Conservative MPs have come to the view that we're going to keep him in for now, get closer to an election, and replace him with a fresh face when we come to an election. Unless something extraordinary happens, really where he can prove himself and redeem himself. But I'd say...
And so many of these extraordinary things do keep happening when it comes to Boris Johnson. I mean, David Cameron referred to him as a greased piglet, just as we thought he was out for the count earlier. The Ukraine came along and he's actually led the world to some respect on the response there. I mean, we shouldn't discount that possibility that something comes along.
No, I mean, he is a survivor. He's been around in British public life for 2 decades. He's a kind of Lazarus figure who keeps rising again. I think it would be naive to completely discount him, but I think he's in the most difficult period of his premiership. I think it is on the rocks. I think that these by-election results have not been good, and I think you hear a lot of Conservatives saying, well, actually the problem is Boris, and if you got rid of him, actually the Conservatives might be in a much better position against Labour.
Although, interestingly, looking at the results of those by-elections and lots of people seeing how the Lib Dems did very well in one part of the country, the Labour Party got in another part of the country, one person who responded to these by-elections was Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, and he seemed to raise the possibility of changing the electoral system of the country. Again, moving away from what's called first past the post towards a proportional system. Why did he bring that up?
Labour politicians talk about PR when they lack the confidence to win. And this is an announcement born out of, I think, a sense of weakness rather than strength. The electoral system favours Labour. Every election since 1945, except the last one, and one in the 1950s, has seen Labour win a greater share of seats in the House of Commons than its percentage of the national popular vote. Right? So this is a system that inflates the number of Labour MPs. I find it astonishing, really, that any Labour politician would advocate for a system that would put Labour at a much greater disadvantage than it is now. And quite frankly, I think PR would lead to the breakup of the Labour Party, because I think the Labour Party is really only held together because of first past the post in Westminster.
And no doubt the Tory party as well, given the factions within that. I suppose first past the post creates these big, broad tents and pushes people together. But what are the prospects of... I mean, there's been a lot of discussion, particularly yesterday, over whether or not there is a secret deal between the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party. Many people denying it, but of course there was a secret deal in 1997 between these two parties.
What I found interesting I've looked at all of the by-election results that have happened in this Parliament, and what's interesting is that when the Lib Dems have gained the seats, and they've gained 3 in this Parliament, they've increased the number of votes that they had relative to the past general election, almost in direct number to Labour votes going down. So you're seeing Labour voters switching to the Liberal Democrats and handing them seats. So the Lib Dems are doing well out of this. You're not seeing Labour benefit to the same scale simply because there are fewer Lib Dem votes to be passed back to Labour. So I can understand why the Liberal Democrats would be very enthusiastic about this. Less clear for Labour, but the thing is that there's an assumption in Labour that the Lib Dems will be an anti-Tory force. And at the moment, that's how they position themselves. But I think as they win more Conservative seats, their parliamentary party is going to go more to the right. And I think, quite frankly, if Boris Johnson wasn't leader of the Conservative Party, the Lib Dems could be open to someone else. Liz Truss herself, a former Lib Dem. So
this is so interesting because the Lib Dems have been focusing on this blue wall strategy. The Lib Dem party itself could change ideologically, moving to a space it occupied under Clegg, who was clearly much more happy to go in with the Tories than the Labour Party.
I think possibly even more so. So I think that Clegg's party contained a lot of student seats that they had won in 2010 on the promise of abolishing tuition fees. Those seats are gone for the Lib Dems now. So where do they make up the difference? It's in kind of rural England, right? The West Country, the Southwest. And those seats are more right-inclined. They're more anti-housing development and some of these policies, which put them really opposite to where Labour wants to to put itself. And so I think that these people who sort of think that Labour and Lib Dem votes are interchangeable really are on another planet, to be quite frank, because I think that actually there are clear schisms between these two parties. And I think it's very irresponsible of people like Andy Burnham to pretend like Lib Dems and Labour are just an interchangeable vote.
Well, Richard Johnson, it's been fascinating to talk through those issues, domestic and international, with you. We'll have to have you back at some point soon, but thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
On The Briefing. Well, now, turning to looking ahead to this week. Last week was tough for the Prime Minister. It was a tough test after those by-election defeats and a new wave of confidence letters, apparently, submitted to the 1922 committee. So despite a divide within the Tory party, why is the Prime Minister actively thinking about a third term in charge? Or could he have just been joking? Well, joining me now is political commentator Andre Walker. Thanks for joining me, Andre. It's extraordinary, I think, that sometimes when the Prime Minister makes a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment, I remember him standing at the dispatch box not so long ago in the House of Commons saying his political career had only barely begun. I wonder if we're over-interpreting some of these more tongue-in-cheek comments.
Well, look, I mean, he's got the hide of a rhinoceros, hasn't he? He's willing to soldier on when people are being very critical of him. Look, I think that there's something to be said for having somebody who's reasonably bombastic and somebody who's in your face and somebody who's going to go out there and attempt to get the job done. Because, look, at the end of the day, what is the big problem that we've got in British politics at the moment? Most of the leaders are genuinely dire. You know, if you look at Keir Starmer, this is a man who should be storming ahead, and yet because of his effective hatred of the Brexit policy, he's just not somebody who's got any traction in Northern England. And then similarly, you look at the Conservative Party. I mean, for me, I always had a problem with Boris Johnson in that he was a massive hypocrite on the issue of lockdown. But look, most of the people that are critical of him absolutely loved the lockdowns and wants them to last virtually in perpetuity. So as far as I'm concerned, the leadership exists with Boris Johnson, not with anybody else.
It's an interesting counterfactual to imagine anyone else in the position of Prime Minister if we would have actually had a different policy. There was often a discussion during those lockdown periods that were Boris Johnson a backbencher, you could almost imagine his Telegraph columns decrying lockdown and imagine him being a leading star of the COVID recovery group, as it became known. But I suppose when you're in the office of Prime Minister, you're actually relatively constrained. You've got advisors around you throwing things in your face, and your ability to move as a decision maker within Number 10 is probably more constrained than people imagine.
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I referred to Chris Whitty as the Prime Minister during that period. I think that Boris was able to lobby Whitty, but I think that the relationship was certainly that Whitty called the shots and Boris lobbied. Personally, by the way, I'd have impeached Whitty. I think he's one of the most dangerous extremists we've ever had in British government. But anyway, that's just me. But as far as I'm concerned, what we have seen is a government that's been totally paralysed by this obsession with COVID, this obsession with the lockdown, this obsession with virtue signalling. And I think that had you not had Boris in there, who was at least a hypocrite rather than a believer, then you would have had significant problems. But Tom, let's get back to the original point here. You know, if Boris Johnson is not the Prime Minister, who are we going to put in? I mean, goodness me, please not Jeremy Hunt.
It's so interesting that there is this failure within the Conservative Party to coalesce around a potential opponent for the Prime Minister. If that's the only thing keeping him in place, perhaps he isn't as safe as is imagined. What does he need to do to win back particularly Conservatives? Because ultimately it's Conservative MPs who will be deciding his fate. How does he shore them up, even in the event that a credible challenger does come along?
The problem with Conservative MPs is they all gob off about how much they love Margaret Thatcher, but secretly they want a Prime Minister like Ted Heath, a middle-of-the-road compromiser who's never going to cause any trouble and will then eventually be dispatched relatively quickly because he hasn't done anything of any real value. The minute that you try and game change, the minute that you try and handbag the Europeans, the minute that you try and stand up for Britain, Conservative MPs absolutely wet their trousers. And that is the fundamental problem. And I think that one of the the issues that we've got to look at in every political party is the fact the candidates being selected for Parliament simply do not reflect the views of the voters. And so, look, as far as I'm concerned, the more Boris Johnson innovates, the more he attempts to stand up for Brexit, the more he attempts to do as Prime Minister, the more these guys are just going to panic and want somebody incredibly boring like Ted Heath to come in and replace him.
Of course, we've got the Northern Ireland Protocol legislation going in before the end of the parliamentary session. We're seeing some of that today. I wonder if the Prime Minister has a bit of a worry here, however. If he starts bringing up the old battles, what are perceived as the old battles of Brexit. Of course, he campaigned to get Brexit done. Most people in the country believe Brexit has been done. Bringing up the constitutional arrangements of Northern Ireland might not be the vote winner that some think it is.
Well, I understand that, but I actually think there's a counter argument, which is you and I are English, and I think English, Welsh and Scottish people have rolled their eyes about Northern Ireland and gone, goodness me, there they are, complaining again. There's always an issue in Northern Ireland. They're always moaning. In reality, we were asleep at the wheel as a United Kingdom on this. What has happened to Northern Ireland has been despicable, and actually we have ended up in a position whereby we've hung them out to dry. Now, just as people roll their eyes about Northern Ireland and think, oh, it's them moaning again, I actually think this time people have realised that we are the people in the wrong. And so whilst I don't think I don't think it's a vote winner to revisit this legislation over Northern Ireland, simply because it's the Conservatives that mucked it up to start with. I don't think it's something that's going to be significantly damaging to have a look at.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how the polls react. Of course, that legislation making its way through, starting off this week. But for now, Andre Walker, thanks for joining us on The Briefing. Really interesting discussion there on the week ahead. Well, that's it for the show today. Coming up, it's To The Point. But first, here's the weather.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking rather unsettled for a time, with showery conditions gradually spreading eastwards. Let's take a look at the details. So, by the middle of the day, the worst of the showers should be clearing from southwest England to leave most parts dry with some sunny spells. However, temperatures will be disappointing for late June. Meanwhile, showers will be breaking out more widely across the southeast, and here a few of them could turn heavy with a chance of some thunder. Across Wales, 1 or 2 light showers are likely, but drier and brighter weather will gradually be spreading in across the country from the west. A few heavy and possibly thundery showers will affect the East Midlands, whilst across Birmingham and other more western areas the showers will start to ease, with more in the way of sunshine developing. Across northeast England, a mix of bright spells and scattered locally heavy and perhaps thundery downpours are on the cards, with temperatures close to 20 degrees in the sunniest spots. Edinburgh and other eastern parts of mainland Scotland could also catch some hefty showers around noon, but across the rest of Scotland the showers should be less heavy and fewer in number. The middle of the day doesn't look too bad for Northern Ireland though, as here any showers will be very isolated, with most parts staying dry and at times quite bright. Heavy showers then will ease across eastern parts to leave a mostly fine end to the day, although rain will arrive across Northern Ireland later. And that's how your weather is shaping up for the rest of your Monday.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from